Hello, you bearded bastards, and welcome to another of my Short Fortress episodes. Now, today's episode is going to be a little bit different than usual, because today, as I have done in the past, I'm not going to be showing any Dwarf Fortress gameplay. Yes, you heard correctly. Now, see, today I want to tell you a story. Now, I had done that episode a couple weeks ago where I did go into Legends mode and I showed off some Forgotten Beast pictures, but a lot of people wanted more. They wanted a story. Who could blame them? And so that got me thinking, how can I get a story out of Legends mode? I mean, sure, I can go through there and try to pick something out, but that's a lot of digging to do. But while I was thinking about this idea, I actually recalled an exceptionally interesting character I spotted once in Legends mode from a game that I played a long time ago. You know, actually, funny story, a long time ago I did do a comic based on one of my Dwarf Fortress games. This comic was called The Holy Shovels. It really didn't end up being much to write home about, but if you want to read it, I'll put a link to it in the description below. Anyways, while I played in this world, I noticed in the Legends mode an exceptionally interesting character, as I had said, and this character was an elf named Epeve. Now, I was racking my brain trying to figure out how I can get Epeve's story to you guys as faithfully as possible without having the original save file. As I said, this was many years ago, but as I was perusing my computer the other day, I found a folder named Holy Shovels, and inside there was a region file. So I downloaded an older version of Dwarf Fortress, and you bearded bastards, I'll tell you what, today, you're in luck. Today I bring to you the story of Epeve Wintercombe, the Maneater. The planet of cyclones. A rather small world surrounded by an endless sea. This is a land filled with a great many people. Dwarves, humans, goblins, elves. Great monsters roam the mountains. The planet of cyclones is a world of imagination and fantasy. A beautiful place. A place held together by a shaky alliance. An alliance between the humans of the Satiny Union and the dwarves of the Purple Tomes. These two evenly matched groups work together in order to dominate this land. The goblins on the western coast? Pah, a mere nuisance. The kobolds? Mosquitoes. And the elves? Well, they control nothing. Just an insignificant patch of pines to the south of the Bald Teeth Mountains. Let them have it. And have it they shall. For in the planet of cyclones, the legend of their druid lord is well known, and greatly feared. Let us now step back to a time before the thrones of men and dwarves were quite so formidable. Back to a time before the elves were feared across this land. To a time when the elves could still walk in peace through this land's forests. More than 150 years ago. The jungles of Intricacy, a cold conifer forest located between the Bald Teeth Mountains and the sweeping tundras in the south. In this forest dwells a small elven nation, the Fern of Tribes. The elves of the Fern of Tribes have lived in this forest peacefully for many years, suffering only minor annoying incursions by the kobolds, as well as only occasional attacks by the lean spider goblins. The dwarves and humans of the north had yet to explore this far south, and were far too busy squabbling amongst themselves to bother. This was the time of greatest peace for the Fern of Tribes. Led by the noble queen, Thalira Ayupili, the elves were able to thrive. The elves of this time lived in a pair of neighboring forest retreats, Awa Meosina and Nitheo Furu, translated meaning Ape's Crater and Whiskered Cages respectively. These two small forest retreats, and the elves within, sat in the pines to the south of the world, living in relative peace and seclusion for nearly 100 years. During this time, the thrones of men and dwarves grew. Wars roiled between the two, and each continued to expand. The Purple Tome dwarves to the west, and the humans of the Satiny Union to the south. War was on its way to the Fern of Tribes. It was only a matter of time. And for the elves of the Fern of Tribes, an age of peace was at its end. Whiskered Cages. Located just to the south of its sister retreat, the elves here live happy lives, coming and going as they wish, and reveling in worship to the natural world that surrounds them. The trees here are ancient, strong, and filled with life. 'Twas among the high boughs of these wizened pines that the main character of our story entered the planet of cyclones. The year was 93, and a pair of new parents were welcoming a brand new generation into the forest, and they would name their son Epeve, winter-calmed. Named, say some, for his calm demeanor, or possibly his pale blue eyes. Whatever the case, the elves of Whiskered Cages rejoiced with the birth of this new youth. Epeve. What would he make of himself? Would he be a great explorer? An adventurer? A poet, perhaps? Such possibility. Such wonder. This young child was loved by all the elves of Whiskered Cages, and by the very pines themselves. Epeve was nurtured as many other elven children are, taught the ways of the plants, the trees. He learned of the natural forces in the world, of the stars, the wind, the sea, and he took it all in, with great joy. But on that fateful day, the child was still so young. The year was 96 when the humans of the Satiny Union first arrived in Whiskered Cages. The giant men were unlike anything the elves have ever encountered, and their numbers were so great. They charged in, destroying, burning, killing every elf they encountered. It was on this dark night that peace died for the Fern of Tribes. Such carnage, such dreadful loss. Entire bloodlines destroyed. Epeve's bloodline included. His mother, his father, and all of his grandparents perished in the attack. That night, the humans of the Satiny Union destroyed Whiskered Cages, and all they encountered within. The ancient pines in their centuries-long vigil burnt to the ground, and whatever wasn't destroyed was taken by the humans. And oddly, this trove included a small child, an elf, found wandering in the fires of Whiskered Cages. Yes, Epeve was taken from this place. As a spoil of war, he would make a fine future slave for the power-mad humans, and so he was brought back to the north, dragged along for many miles, through lands no other elf had set eyes upon before, and all the possibilities of a young life stayed behind in that burned husk. Things were different now, and they would never again be the same. Taxed Sinew, capital of the Satiny Union. This human-wrought town on the coast had the highest walls and the tallest parapets found anywhere in the land, and many thousands of humans lived within. They and the dwarves to the west had recently reached an agreement, a truce, and the benefits of this were already being seen by both sides. Trade was flourishing, and greatly skilled crafts dwarves could already be found working in town, which was quickly evolving. It was in this town that Epeve would be raised, far, far away from the southern forests. He would not be taught about water, about wind, earth, about plants and trees, boulders. No. In Epeve's new life, he would be a slave, beaten, starved. His youngest years could best be described as a series of nightmares. There was no hope for him, not for a slave. But Epeve was a wily one. The young elf learned everything there was to know about the horrendous world that surrounded him now. He took in every ounce of information about the humans, their ways, their customs. He did this while he labored, mostly as a house slave. His small body was no good at intense labor. In time, the young elf had earned the trust of his masters, and was allowed to travel through Taxed Sinew. He saw the streets, the buildings, the other humans, brutish creatures, loud, very unnatural. He passed through the bustling markets, the smelly pier, but one place in particular caught the elf's attention. A dark chapel. It seemed that there was constantly a dark shroud wrapped around this place. It sat decaying at the outskirts of town, and its visitors were few. It was known as the Doomed Chapel, and was home to the Ungodly Bones denomination, worshippers of the human goddess, Eslim, goddess of murder, death, and disease. This place was dark indeed, and not many of the humans talked of it. They seemed afraid of it, of its power perhaps, and this fact intrigued Epeve greatly. But for now he continued his toil, laboring ever so faithfully for his human masters. He would do what he had to do to earn their trust, and once he was finally fully in their trust, he would use it against them. By the year 105, Epeve was now 12 years old, and seen as an adult in the eyes of the humans. Such a faithful worker, truly an asset to the Satiny Union. Such a trustworthy slave could be given a real task, and so Epeve earned a bow, a backpack, and some boots. He became a ranger. He was finally allowed out of town, on short hunting expeditions. He was still a slave after all. It was during these travels that Epeve was finally able to see the true wonder of nature. Though not as lush and vibrant as the forests of the south, the hills that surrounded Tax Sinew were still a wonderfully natural place. Grasses and shrubberies, and trees. The sight of these more than anything drove this young elf, angered him. But still he would bide his time. No sense in getting himself killed now. And he had heard the stories. Elves are immortal. They can't die of old age. And so as long as he was careful, and didn't get himself killed by other means, he would be able to see the death of every human that lived in Tax Sinew. And it would be sweet. Oh, so sweet. Damn giant bastards. But for now, he had to bide his time. Patience. He would hold that one ideal close to his heart, and every night returned faithfully to his masters in Tax Sinew. Those giant bastards. Life continued on much the same for Epeve. For another year anyways. This whole time he had been watching that dark chapel in the outskirts of town, and in 106, he finally made a visit to this dark place. In 106, Epeve began worshipping Eslim, and became a member of the Ungodly Bones denomination. Although still a slave, he was deep enough in his master's good graces to have earned some free time on the side, and every second of this time was spent in the doomed chapel. He pored over the scrolls held within, learned every bit of information he could about his dark god. This information powered Epeve, fueled his desire for revenge. Eslim was his goddess now, and he would praise her. But he had to remember to bide his time. Patience. He held it close to his heart still, and so he continued with his toil. His days were spent trekking the hills around Tax Sinew, on the hunt for game for his damn human masters, and his nights were spent in the doomed cathedral, where he gathered every bit of information he could about his new god. And all the while, a dark hatred burned within the elf. These humans would pay. Every last one of them. Over the years, Epeve's hunt for information about the dark goddess Eslim was noticed by his peers in the doomed chapel. They began to admire the elf, a simple slave, who was so consumed with this dark goddess. His sheer devotion to the religion was awe-inspiring to the other acolytes. Oddly, they began to look up to this elf, this slave, and through perseverance and power of will, in the year 113, Epeve achieved the rank of Exalted Filth within the Ungodly Bones denomination. Epeve had become the highest priest of Eslim, the most knowledgeable, the most devoted, and his new rank showed this. Although still a slave, the elf wore this new mantle proudly. He knew he had achieved something great, and now it was only a matter of time. A strange thing it is to lead an entire religion, alongside being a slave. But, odd as it was, Epeve always seemed to stay faithful to his masters, and every night, he could be relied on to return with the day's findings. What a loyal elf. This is how Epeve lived his life, year after year after year, groveling to his human masters, while simultaneously leading the cult of Eslim, a strange double life. That Epeve was able to work magnificently. 4, 5, 6 years passed, and all the while Epeve learned more and more about the arts of death and murder, and all the while his seething hatred for the humans grew. It boiled within him. The time for his departure was nigh, and in the year 127, at the age of 34 years old, while out on a hunting expedition, Epeve left and fled into the Violet Omen Hills. At this point, he had grown more than weary of his slave life. The humans sickened him, and he could take no more, and so he decided to wander, traveling over the Violet Omen Hills, evading patrols and travelers on the road. The elf slave was well known, and would be easy to spot, but he was wily, and they would not have the chance. In this new fugitive life, Epeve could finally feel truly free. He wandered the hills, took in the nature, slept under the stars. The world was beautiful, but still, this was not his home. His home was far to the south, and so he returned, back to the south, to the jungles of Intricacy, a winding trip that he enjoyed very much. And as he approached his former home, the trees grew taller, the brush more thick and vibrant. To this point, none of the civilized people had made their homes in the south. This was a pure place. This was his home. And finally, in the year 128, 32 years after he left, Epeve again rejoined the Fern of Tribes and settled in Apes Crater, his home village's sister retreat. Epeve was welcomed warmly by his brethren. His life had been hard. Every elf could tell. They could see it in his darkened eyes. Truly, the wonders of this new home lifted his spirits like nothing else possible. To be in his home, such a beautiful, natural place, but the joy can only do so much. He was a hardened person, poisoned. A rage coursed within his veins. Pure hatred burned in his brain, and Eslim demanded worship. But for now, he would try his very best to quell these inner urges. This was his home. Everything he wanted should be here, and so he would try. He would live this new life, and try his very best to ignore that dark agony within. And so, Epeve became an acolyte, a worshipper of this natural place. And on top of this, he got an honest job as a clerk. This was his new life now. He had to forget the past and the humans, giant gargantuan bastards. It was all behind him now. And now, Epeve could finally live a free life in Apes Crater. Initially, Epeve took very well to his new life. It was nice to finally be surrounded with other like-minded people. In Apes Crater, he could feel at peace. This was a protected place, and Epeve was finally able to make his life into something worth living. He cared deeply for his fellow elves, as they cared for him. But still, there always seemed to be something unsettled with the elf. He could not fully enjoy this new life, for no matter how hard he tried, deep inside, a tiny burning splinter of hatred could always be found. But for 10 years he was able to ignore this annoying facet. The humans were a thing of his past. There was no point in digging up such hatred, and so he tried, and succeeded, in enjoying his new life. Until that fateful day, towards the end of summer, 10 years after he arrived in Apes Crater. Epeve wanted a change, and so he settled in whiskered cages. Some elves still lived in this place, and nature had begun to return. The trees here were young, the brush not quite as thick as in Apes Crater, but it was a nice change for Epeve, who needed the change of scenery. But unfortunately, the year 138 is when the humans of the Satiny Union decided to make a return trip to whiskered cages, and Epeve would finally be able to get his revenge, for that dark splinter that burned within him had never been fully extinguished, and now it was time for it to emerge. To this very day, scholars still debate over what happened that dark night in whiskered cages. Some attribute the events that occurred there to Eslim herself, while still others solely credit Epeve. What can be certain is that the level of sheer carnage and bloodthirsty violence that occurred in that elven retreat was unlike anything ever seen in the planet of cyclones. The humans, armed with weapons and armor of metal, should never have suffered the losses that they did. Hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of humans fell dead in that forest, all in a single night, a feat that should have been far beyond the power of the elves, who were armed with weapons of wood, and whose numbers were very few. Was it possible for a single elf to wreak such carnage? Or perhaps the elf had become a puppet of Eslim, goddess of death and murder. Today, it's difficult to say, as this tale isn't freely told amongst the humans, but for the elves, it has become a cherished legend. In a single night, Epeve had killed over 1,300 humans, all with his bare hands or scant arms. Yes, the elves of the Fern of Tribes love telling this tale more than any other. But this, my friends, isn't the elves' favorite part of the story yet. For you see, after the battle was over, the blood was spilled. Epeve was not finished with the humans, and what happened next baffled even the elves of the Fern of Tribes. You see, after the great battle of 138, Epeve began to devour his enemies. Nobody can be sure how he achieved this feat exactly, or why he chose to eat the men, or how he chose to eat these men, for one would think it would be an impossible feat. But it is generally agreed on that after the Battle of 138, Epeve devoured his way through 88 humans, one after the other, after the other. Such grotesque hunger. Now it should be mentioned that in the Fern of Tribes, The eating of intelligent beings is not a taboo subject matter, but it has never occurred on such a scale. 88 humans, all in the late summer of 138. The Great Devouring. Epeve was finally satiated, and the humans of the Satiny Union would never again harass the elves of the Fern of Tribes. Epeve's dark quest was at its end, and he could now finally live a happy life. And in the following year, he became a clothier in whiskered cages. But at this point, his legend was only growing. The elves loved him. He was their protector, their defender, and so such a mundane life could never last. And so, with his stories growing, in the year 145, he moved back to Ape's Crater and became the Druid of the Fern of Tribes, their highest position. He would rule the Fern of Tribes now, and the few elves that remained would thrive under his guidance. And that, my friends, is the ancient tale of Epeve the Maneater. I hope you all enjoyed this story. It was really kind of labor intensive, what with all those pictures. I believe there were 51 pictures this episode. But as I said, I remember seeing this story a long time ago, and I was always a big fan of it. I wanted to make a comic of it back in the day, but I never got around to it. So I'm really glad I got a chance to tell you this story. Another interesting fact, this was the very first time I ever took a look through Legends mode in Dwarf Fortress. So if you've never taken a peek in there, I suggest you do. There is some pretty neat stuff to be found in Legends mode. Whole stories just waiting to be seen. Oh, another thing I just thought of. If you happen to have any friends who are interested in Dwarf Fortress and don't know how to get into the game, maybe you could share this video with them. I really tried to make it appealing to non-Dwarf Fortress players, what with all the pictures that were in there, so you really don't have to know too much about the game to understand what's going on in this story. I'm really hoping to inspire some new players with it, and I think that would be pretty cool. Anyways, fellas, again, I hope you enjoyed watching this episode. I know it was a bit different than usual, and I certainly hope you'll join me next week for whatever the hell I end up doing. And until then, you bearded bastards,